I never expected the biggest traffic problem in my neighborhood to end up happening on my front lawn, but that's exactly what happened. My name is Ethan Mercer, and a few years ago, I bought a corner house in a quiet suburb outside mid-sized city. It wasn't some luxury property or dream mansion, just a comfortable place with a decent yard and enough space that I could finally enjoy a little peace after years of apartment living. One of the things I loved most was the broad stretch of grass between my driveway and the intersection. It wasn't fancy, but I took pride in keeping it healthy. Every Saturday morning, I'd be out there watering, trimming, and doing the kind of homeowner stuff nobody enjoys until they actually own a house. For a while, everything was fine. Then one morning, I noticed tire marks cutting across the edge of the grass. At first, I figured someone had accidentally drifted too far while making a turn. It happens. I shrugged it off and reseeded the damaged patch. A few days later, I saw fresh tracks. Same location, same angle. That got my attention. Then another set appeared. Then another. Before long, I realized this wasn't random. Drivers were intentionally leaving the road, crossing my lawn, and jumping ahead of traffic waiting at the light. The intersection connected a residential street to a busy commercial road, and during rush hour the line of cars could stretch pretty far back. Apparently some genius discovered that if they cut across my property, they could skip several vehicles and merge farther ahead. What amazed me wasn't that one person tried it. What amazed me was how quickly everyone else copied it. Human beings are funny that way. Give somebody an unofficial shortcut, and suddenly it becomes a public highway. Every morning, I watch more cars follow the exact same path. Sedans, SUVs, pickup trucks, delivery vans, it didn't matter. They'd roll right over my grass without hesitation. The tire marks got deeper every week. The lawn flattened. Then patches of dirt started showing through. Eventually, there was an actual trail carved through the yard, like some kind of unofficial access road. Looking out the window became increasingly frustrating because every fresh set of tracks felt like a stranger walking through my living room. What really bothered me was the attitude behind it. Nobody slowed down. Nobody looked guilty. Nobody acted uncertain. They behaved as though the property line simply didn't exist. One morning, I was drinking coffee by the front window when I counted 10 vehicles crossing the lawn in less than 30 minutes. 10. That's when something clicked in my head. The issue wasn't visibility. The issue wasn't confusion. They knew exactly what they were doing. They just didn't care. So I tried the polite solutions first. I bought decorative landscaping stones and arranged them along the edge of the grass. Within days, several had been pushed aside. Then I installed small wooden stakes. Some were snapped. Others were knocked flat. After that, I put up a sign that clearly said, "Private property, please stay OFF the grass." The sign may as well have been invisible. Drivers kept cutting through as if it wasn't there. The more I watched, the more irritated I became, not because of the lawn itself, but because of what it represented. There seemed to be this unspoken assumption that convenience outweighed respect. If waiting at a red light cost somebody 30 extra seconds, then apparently my property rights became optional. One afternoon, I was repairing another damage patch when a neighbor named Carl walked over. He looked at the dirt trail running across the yard and laughed. "Looks like you've got your own little road now," he said. I laughed too, but honestly I wasn't amused. Feels more like I accidentally donated part of my property to impatient strangers. I told him. Carl shook his head and said something that stuck with me. People only respect boundaries they believe are real. At the time, it sounded like casual neighborhood wisdom. A few weeks later, it would become the entire solution. The final straw came on a rainy Tuesday morning. The grass was already weak from constant abuse, and one large SUV tore through the lawn so aggressively that chunks of wet soil sprayed across the sidewalk. I stood there staring through the window thinking, "You've got to be kidding me." That's when I stopped looking for ways to ask people nicely. Because the truth was simple, I'd already asked. Repeatedly. The signs were clear. The property lines were obvious. The requests had been ignored. What I needed wasn't a better warning. What I needed was a way to make the boundary impossible to overlook. And that realization sent my mind in a completely different direction. Instead of asking how to stop the drivers, I started asking what made them so confident in the first place. Once I figured that out, the answer became surprisingly obvious. And by the following weekend, I was standing in my yard with a shovel, a measuring tape, and a plan that nobody saw coming. Before I tell you what I did next, let me pause the story for a second, because there's actually something interesting happening here from both a legal and psychological standpoint. According to standard procedure, property owners are generally expected to make reasonable efforts to protect their land without creating hazards for the public. That's an important distinction. From a legal perspective, there's a huge difference between setting a trap designed to damage someone's vehicle and reinforcing your own property to prevent unauthorized access. Those are not the same thing. But the psychology is even more fascinating. This is a psychological trap people create for themselves when convenience slowly turns into entitlement. The first driver probably knew they were doing something wrong. The 10th driver assumed it must be acceptable because everyone else was doing it. That's how bad behavior normalizes itself. People stop asking whether they should do something and start asking whether they can get away with it. Once that mindset takes hold, signs become background noise and common courtesy disappears. The lesson here is that most boundary violations don't begin with hostility. They begin with small acts of convenience that face no consequences, and over time those small acts grow into habits that people genuinely believe they're entitled to continue. Unfortunately for the drivers using my lawn, they were about to discover that habits can disappear just as quickly as they form. That Saturday morning, I walked outside before sunrise carrying a shovel, several bags of fresh soil, a wheelbarrow, and materials I'd spent the entire week carefully researching. I wasn't angry anymore, which honestly surprised me. A month earlier, I probably would have approached the situation emotionally. By that point, though, I had reached something much more dangerous than anger. I had reached patience. Patience gives you time to think. Patience gives you time to plan. And patience lets you solve a problem once instead of fighting it forever. The first thing I did was study the trail itself. The drivers had unknowingly provided a perfect blueprint. Every tire track followed nearly the exact same curve. Human beings love routine. Once they discover a path that works, they rarely change it. So instead of trying to predict where cars might go, I simply followed the route they had already chosen. I marked the entire shortcut from the point where vehicles left the pavement to the point where they re-entered the road. Then I began digging a narrow trench beneath the worn section of grass. It wasn't especially deep, but it didn't need to be. My goal wasn't to create danger. My goal was to create resistance. Over the next several hours, I installed a series of reinforced steel posts anchored securely below ground level. Each one was positioned carefully enough to strengthen the soil and prevent vehicles from rolling smoothly across the route they had been using. Once everything was in place, I covered the area with fresh soil, leveled the surface, and laid down new sod. By late afternoon, the yard looked better than it had in months. If someone had driven by, they would have assumed I was simply repairing damaged landscaping. Technically, that's exactly what I was doing. Sunday came and went. That evening, I sat near the front window with a drink in my hand, staring at the intersection. I felt strangely calm. Maybe it would work. Maybe it wouldn't. Either way, I was done playing defense. Monday morning arrived right on schedule. Rush hour traffic started building shortly after 7. I watched the line of vehicles stretch back from the light exactly as it always did. Then I saw the first familiar movement. A silver sedan drifted toward the edge of the road. Without hesitation, the driver turned off the pavement and aimed directly for the shortcut. I actually laughed because the confidence was incredible. The car rolled onto the grass exactly where hundreds of vehicles had done before. Then it stopped. Not violently, not dramatically. It simply met enough resistance that the driver immediately realized something had changed. The sedan paused, sat there for a few seconds, then slowly backed up and returned to the road. I nearly spilled my coffee, trying not to laugh. A few minutes later, another vehicle tried. Same result. Then a pickup truck. Same result again. The interesting part wasn't the vehicle stopping. The interesting part was what happened afterward. Drivers began watching each other. One failed attempt created curiosity. 2 failed attempts created uncertainty. 3 failed attempts created caution. By the 4th vehicle, people weren't charging confidently across the grass anymore. They were creeping forward, testing the ground, and reconsidering their decisions before fully committing. This is a psychological trap in reverse. The same herd mentality that had encouraged people to use the shortcut was now discouraging them from trying it. Human behavior spreads quickly in both directions. Around midweek, I witnessed my favorite moment. A black SUV pulled up near the intersection and started moving toward the lawn. At the same time, another driver waiting at the light rolled down his window and shouted, "Don't do it, man." The SUV stopped immediately. The driver looked confused. "Why?" he yelled back. The other guy shrugged and replied, "No idea. It just doesn't work anymore." I laughed so hard I nearly choked on my coffee. Imagine that conversation from my perspective. For months, these people had treated my yard like public infrastructure. Now, they were standing around trying to solve the mystery of why the magical shortcut had stopped functioning. By Friday, the traffic pattern had changed dramatically. Most drivers didn't even attempt to cut through anymore. Word had apparently spread through the local commuter population. Nobody knew exactly what had happened, but everyone knew something had changed. The dirt trail stopped growing. No new tire marks appeared. The grass finally had a chance to recover. A week later, my neighbor Carl came over again. He looked at the lawn, then looked at the traffic waiting properly at the intersection. "Well," he said with a grin, "looks like your road closed." "Seems that way," I replied. He glanced at me suspiciously. "What did you do?" I shrugged. "Nothing special, just improved the landscaping." He laughed because he knew there was more to the story, but he didn't push for details. The following weeks were surprisingly satisfying. Every morning, I watched cars line up at the light exactly as they were supposed to. No dramatic confrontations, no angry notes, no arguments with strangers, just normal traffic behavior returning to normal roads. And the lawn responded almost immediately. Areas that had been bare dirt began filling in with healthy green growth. The ugly scar running across the property started fading. Each week, the shortcut became harder to see. Within a month, there was barely any evidence it had ever existed. What fascinated me most was how quickly people adapted. For months, they had acted as though crossing private property was completely reasonable. Then the moment it became inconvenient, they abandoned the behavior almost overnight. Not because they suddenly respected my lawn. Not because they had a moral awakening. They stopped because the shortcut no longer benefited them. That's a reality a lot of homeowners eventually learn. Sometimes people don't respond to requests. Sometimes they don't respond to signs. Sometimes they don't even respond to common courtesy. What they respond to is friction. Remove the reward, and the behavior often disappears on its own. One morning, about 6 weeks after I completed the project, I stood at the same window where I'd once counted 10 vehicles crossing the lawn in 30 minutes. This time I watched dozens of cars wait patiently at the light. Nobody touched the grass. Nobody attempted the shortcut. Nobody even looked at the yard anymore. The temptation was gone because the opportunity was gone. The strange thing is that I never actually blocked the path. There was no fence, no gate, no concrete varia, no giant warning sign. From a distance, the lawn looked exactly as it always had. The difference existed beneath the surface, invisible to anyone who respected the property line and immediately obvious to anyone who didn't. And that's what made the solution so satisfying. I hadn't created a confrontation. I hadn't started a feud. I had simply restored reality. The yard was never part of the road. People had only convinced themselves it was because nothing challenged that assumption. Once the assumption disappeared, the behavior disappeared with it. By the end of the season, the grass was healthier than it had been since I bought the house. The shortcut had completely vanished. And every single morning, when traffic backed up at that intersection, drivers waited their turn just like everyone else. The funny thing is that the solution wasn't really about landscaping at all. It was about boundaries. Because the moment a boundary becomes real, people suddenly remember it was there the whole time. A few months after everything settled down, I found myself thinking less about the lawn and more about what the whole situation revealed about people. The grass had fully recovered by then. If you visited my house today, you would never know that hundreds of vehicles once treated part of the property like a private express lane. The dirt track was gone. The tire marks were gone. Even the frustration had mostly faded. What remained was the lesson. And honestly, that lesson had very little to do with traffic. Looking back, I don't think most of those drivers were bad people. I know that's probably not the dramatic answer some viewers want to hear, but it's true. Most of them were probably ordinary people running late for work, trying to get home faster, or convincing themselves that one tiny shortcut didn't really matter. The problem is that when enough people tell themselves the same story, small acts of selfishness start feeling normal. That's how a worn path forms across a lawn. That's how someone else's property becomes everybody's convenience. And that's how boundaries slowly disappear without anyone consciously deciding to remove them. According to standard procedure, communities function because most people agree to respect rules even when breaking them would be easier. Stop signs, property lines, waiting your turn in traffic, standing in line at a store, none of these things work because they're physically impossible to ignore. They work because most people accept that certain boundaries deserve respect. Once enough people decide those boundaries are optional, everything starts getting messy. From a legal perspective, that's why property rights exist in the first place. They aren't just about ownership. They're about predictability. They're about creating clear expectations so that one person's convenience doesn't become another person's burden. What surprised me most was how quickly behavior changed once the shortcut stopped being attractive. There were no public arguments, no neighborhood meetings, no social media debates, no dramatic confrontations. The behavior simply vanished. That's something worth remembering because we often assume people need long speeches or complicated explanations to change. In reality, behavior usually follows incentives. Change the incentive, and you often change the behavior. This is a psychological trap many people fall into without realizing it. We tend to think we're making independent decisions, but we're heavily influenced by what everyone around us appears to be doing. When drivers saw tire tracks across my lawn, they interpreted those tracks as permission. If everyone else was doing it, it couldn't be that wrong, right? Then the opposite happened. Once people saw other drivers avoiding the shortcut, they started avoiding it too. The same social influence that created the problem ultimately helped solve it. The lesson here is that boundaries matter, but enforcement matters too. Not because people are evil, but because human beings naturally test limits. If a line exists but never affects anyone's behavior, sooner or later somebody will start treating it like decoration. That's true in neighborhoods, workplaces, friendships, businesses, and pretty much every other part of life. One thing I'm especially happy about is that nobody got hurt. No vehicles were damaged. No screaming matches happened in the street. Nobody ended up on the evening news. The solution remained boring, practical, and effective. Which honestly is the best kind of solution. Sometimes the most satisfying victories aren't the loud ones. They're the quiet moments when a problem simply stops existing. Every now and then a neighbor still asks what finally ended the shortcut. I usually smile and give some vague answer about landscaping improvements. The truth is less exciting than people imagine. There is no secret revenge scheme. There is no dramatic showdown. There is just a homeowner deciding that if people wouldn't respect a boundary voluntarily, the property itself would gently remind them where that boundary existed. So now I'm curious what you think. If you were dealing with drivers constantly crossing your property, what would you have done? Would you have installed a fence? Added large rocks? Called local authorities? Or would you have handled it differently altogether? Let me know down in the comments, because situations like this always spark interesting debates. And honestly, that's part of why I wanted to share the story. Not because of the lawn, but because everyone eventually encounters some version of this problem. Maybe it's a property dispute. Maybe it's a workplace issue. Maybe it's a personal relationship where someone keeps pushing limits because nobody ever pushes back. Whatever the situation, the principle remains surprisingly similar. Respect grows where boundaries are clear. And sometimes the most powerful response isn't confrontation, anger, or revenge. Sometimes it's simply creating a reality where the wrong choice is no longer the easiest choice. In the end, I didn't win because I outsmarted the drivers. I won because I stopped arguing with behavior and started changing the conditions that allowed the behavior to exist. Once that happened, everything else took care of itself. And every morning when I look out at a healthy green lawn instead of dirt road, I'm reminded of a simple truth. People often ignore the boundaries they can cross, but they rarely ignore the boundaries that actually stand their ground.